January 1943, the M1 Garand. The North African sun burns over the jagged ridges of Tunisia. The desert air trembles with heat and the smell of dust and oil. Along a shallow ridge, German soldiers crouch behind rocks, their rifles steady, eyes fixed on the advancing line of American troops far across the plain. They are veterans of years of war, men who have marched from Poland to France, who fought the Soviets on the frozen plains. To them, these young Americans look like amateurs. Fresh faces, new uniforms, clean rifles. One German corporal squints through his field glasses and laughs. They carry toys, he says, watching the unfamiliar shape of the Americans' rifles. Shorter, bulkier than the familiar Mauser Kar 98K. Too heavy, too complicated. The men around him smirk, but within minutes that laughter dies. The Americans open fire. It isn't the slow, rhythmic crack of bolt-action rifles they expect. Instead, it's a steady, relentless roar, each shot rolling into the next, an unbroken storm of gunfire that pins them to the sand. The desert fills with a new sound, sharp, mechanical, rhythmic, followed by the metallic ping of spent clips ejected into the heat. The Germans dive for cover, confusion on their faces. They've never heard anything like it. Because for the first time in history, an entire army is equipped not with bolt-action rifles, but with something faster, deadlier, and far ahead of its time, a weapon that would change how wars were fought and how soldiers survived them. This is the story of the rifle that turned laughter into silence and disbelief into fear. By the start of 1943, the world was deep in chaos. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had dominated much of the planet for nearly 4 years. Europe was enslaved under Nazi rule. Asia burned under the Japanese flag. The Allied nations, Britain, the Soviet Union, and now the United States, struggled to push back against forces that seemed unstoppable. For the United States, the war was still young. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America had mobilized at a pace never seen before in human history. Millions of men had been drafted, trained, and shipped overseas. Tanks, planes, and ships poured from American factories in endless streams. But when these fresh American troops first landed in North Africa in late 1942, they faced something they'd never known: battle-hardened German veterans of the Afrika Korps. Under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, these men were masters of desert warfare. They had defeated British forces again and again, even when outnumbered. The Americans arrived confident and untested. The Germans watched them through the lens of experience and arrogance. They saw in them the same flaws they once saw in the British: slow, predictable, and unsure. But what the Germans didn't see, what they couldn't yet understand, was that these Americans carried something different, not just in spirit, but in steel. The rifle in their hands wasn't another bolt-action relic. It was the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. At the start of World War II, nearly every army on Earth equipped its soldiers with bolt-action rifles. The German Karabiner 98K, descendant of the legendary Mauser rifle, was precise and deadly but slow. Each shot required the soldier to lift, pull, and reset the bolt. A skilled marksman might manage 15 rounds a minute, if he was calm and lucky. The British Lee Enfield was faster, with a 10-round magazine and smoother action, but it was still a bolt action. The Soviet Mosin Nagant, the Japanese Arisaka, all shared the same rhythm: aim, fire, cycle, aim again. The world's infantry battles followed a familiar tempo, a century-old drumbeat born in the trenches of the First World War. But the M1 Garand broke that rhythm. For the first time, ordinary infantrymen could unleash a sustained stream of fire without breaking aim, without shifting their position, without pausing to reload after every shot. Each pull of the trigger delivered a .30-06 round, powerful enough to tear through cover or drop an enemy at hundreds of yards. The recoil was sharp but manageable. The 8-round en-bloc clip fed smoothly into the chamber, and when empty it ejected itself with that unmistakable metallic ping. It was mechanical poetry. A design that fused speed, reliability, and power, something the old empires didn't yet understand. The story of the M1 Garand began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet workshop of a Canadian-born engineer. John Cantius Garand, a reserved, meticulous man, had worked for years at the U.S. Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, he labored over designs for a self-loading rifle, a weapon that could use the gas from each fired round to automatically cycle the next. At the time, most military experts dismissed the idea as fantasy. The bolt-action rifle was considered perfect, simple, rugged, battle-proven. Semi-automatic designs were thought to be too fragile, too complex for mass issue. But Garand persisted. His final prototype, completed in 1936, stunned Army evaluators. It was simple, reliable, and faster than anything before it. After years of trials, the U.S. Army officially adopted it as the M1 Garand, making America the first major nation in history to equip all its frontline troops with a semi-automatic. Rifle General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. By 1941, as the clouds of war darkened, the Springfield Armory and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company began mass-producing the rifle. Each M1 Garand took about 50 man-hours to build. Precision-machined parts, walnut stocks, gas-operated mechanisms built to withstand the grit of war. When the U.S. entered World War II, production surged beyond anything previously imagined. By 1945, over 4 million Garands would roll off American assembly lines, each one a symbol of industrial might and military innovation. The rifle's true test came in North Africa, where the American II Corps faced the seasoned troops of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Early battles, like Kasserine Pass, exposed the Americans' inexperience. They were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outled. Tanks were destroyed, lines broken, and entire battalions scattered under German fire. But even amid chaos, there was one constant: the M1 Garand's steady voice cutting through the desert. German soldiers noticed it immediately. Reports from Afrika Korps units described the enemy's fast and continuous rifle fire. They had never faced ordinary infantry who could fire that quickly. A single American rifle squad could lay down a curtain of bullets that rivaled the rate of a German machine gun team. The difference wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. For the first time, German soldiers found themselves pinned by men armed only with rifles. The battlefield balance, once dictated by machine guns and mortars, began to tilt. One veteran of the 10th Panzer Division later recalled, "We thought at first they were using automatic weapons. But then we realized it was their rifles. All of them, the Garand had arrived, and the old world of warfare would never sound the same again. Behind every rifle was an entire nation's determination. The U.S. had entered the war not just with manpower, but with industry, factories that could outproduce entire continents. At Springfield Armory, precision machines carved thousands of receivers a day. In Detroit, automobile plants retooled to produce rifle parts instead of cars. Women worked the lathes and presses, keeping pace with demand. By mid-1943, every American soldier from Tunisia to Sicily carried an M1 Garand. It became the equalizer in a war where experience favored the enemy, and while other nations clung to old doctrines, the Americans adapted. Their tactics evolved around the rhythm of the Garand: rapid fire, short advances, overwhelming pressure. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a system, a philosophy of modern combat. The Germans would soon learn that lesson again, this time in the hedgerows of France, under a sky filled with American aircraft and the echo of that relentless 8-round chorus. By mid-1943, the Desert War was ending. Rommel's Afrika Korps was trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army from the east and the Americans from the west. The final German convoys fled across the sand, leaving behind wrecked tanks and scorched ammunition dumps. Among the Allied ranks, the once green American soldiers had learned fast, and learned hard. Their discipline, tactics, and morale had transformed. But beneath the dust and fatigue, something deeper had changed: confidence. Confidence born not only from survival, but from trust, in their weapon and in the men beside them. For the average American infantryman, the M1 Garand was more than a rifle. It was reassurance, cold, heavy, and utterly reliable. When a man carried it, he felt he stood a chance. Letters home reflected this bond. "It kicks like a mule," one private wrote to his father, "but it'll save your life faster than you can blink." Another wrote from Tunisia, When you've got this thing, you can fight 10 of them and keep shooting. The Garand gave ordinary men extraordinary reach. In the chaos of combat, in foxholes, ravines, or ruined villages, the rifle's steady rhythm brought order. You could feel it when whole platoons opened fire at once, a deep, rolling thunder that broke enemy charges and filled the air with dust and brass. To German soldiers used to the sharp, spaced cracks of bolt-action fire, the Garand's tempo was alien. It felt endless, merciless, mechanical, like facing a dozen machine guns at once. And for American troops, that psychological edge mattered. They had seen the German army at its fiercest, Rommel's armor, the discipline of the Wehrmacht, yet with the Garand in their hands, they no longer felt like underdogs. They were the storm now. German reports from late 1943 began to mention the unusual firepower of American riflemen. Commanders initially assumed they were using submachine guns or light automatics, but when captured rifles were examined, the truth stunned them. The Americans had issued semi-automatics to everyone. For German infantrymen, the comparison was sobering. Their Kar 98K was a masterpiece of precision, long, elegant, deadly accurate, but it belonged to a slower time. Against the M1, it demanded too much motion, too many seconds between shots. In modern combat, seconds meant life or death. One German sergeant captured in Sicily told his interrogators, "They can fire and move without pause. We can't match that." Another added, "It is like fighting an army of machine gunners." As the Allies advanced from Tunisia into Sicily and Italy, the myth of American inexperience faded quickly. German veterans began to realize that behind those inexperienced faces was a machine of war, unlike anything they'd seen. One built on speed, production, and relentless adaptation. The genius of the M1 wasn't just its design, it was its timing. The rifle's semi-automatic action worked through a gas system that used the energy from a fired round to eject the spent casing and load the next. It was rugged enough to endure sand, mud, and snow, yet simple enough for soldiers to clean in the field. The heart of the weapon, its gas cylinder and operating rod, made the Garand uniquely stable. It absorbed recoil in a straight line, allowing faster follow-up shots and better accuracy under stress. The en-bloc clip, while limited to 8 rounds, gave consistent feeding and balance. In the hands of trained troops, the rifle could unleash more than 40 accurate shots a minute, nearly triple what a German rifleman could deliver with a Kar 98K. But the true brilliance lay in logistics. Unlike the Germans, who issued semi-automatic rifles like the G41 and later G43 only in small numbers, the United States mass-produced the Garand on an industrial scale. It wasn't just a weapon of innovation, it was a weapon of abundance. By the time American troops prepared for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, over 1 million Garands were already in the field. Each crate marked U.S. Rifle Caliber 30. M1 represented a philosophy that every soldier deserved the best tool possible, not just the elite. That philosophy was about to reshape the European battlefield. In Sicily, under the harsh Mediterranean sun, U.S. troops learned how to fight as one, riflemen, machine gunners, and armor moving together in rhythm. The Garand's semi-automatic fire allowed squads to maintain suppression, even without support weapons. German patrols that once relied on short, decisive ambushes found themselves pinned down by rifle fire alone. Every time they lifted their heads, another 8-round burst cracked through the air. The Americans had found their balance between precision and volume, between marksmanship and momentum. This advantage became doctrine. U.S. infantry manuals began emphasizing fire superiority, the idea that continuous, controlled shooting could overwhelm even better trained enemies. The Garand made that philosophy possible. Meanwhile, the Germans scrambled to catch up. They began rushing production of their own semi-automatic rifles like the G43 and experimented with the revolutionary STG-44 assault rifle. But by the time these weapons reached the front, the tide of war had already turned. The Americans had not only caught up, they were accelerating ahead. High command noticed the difference. Reports from field officers spoke repeatedly of the Garand's impact. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later call it one of the key factors in American infantry success. Patton's praise, The greatest battle implement ever devised became legend, but these weren't exaggerations. In the field, numbers proved them right. A U.S. rifle squad equipped with Garands could deliver more than 700 aimed rounds per minute, compared to roughly 300 from a similarly sized German unit. The advantage was both tactical and psychological. Where the enemy hesitated, Americans advanced. The rifle became a symbol of momentum, of a nation unwilling to pause. For soldiers and civilians alike, the M1 Garand symbolized something deeper than engineering. It was America's industrial soul turned into steel. In every factory that built its parts, from Massachusetts to Illinois, workers knew they were shaping more than metal. They were shaping survival. Newsreels showed lines of gleaming rifles, stacked like rows of soldiers, and narrated with quiet pride, "The American soldier carries the best rifle in the world." That message mattered. It told troops overseas that they weren't just another army. They were the cutting edge of freedom's arsenal. For the Germans, that message echoed too. Captured propaganda leaflets described the Americans' inexhaustible fire, an acknowledgement that even the Wehrmacht's finest could no longer rely on technical superiority. By the winter of 1943, the laughter had stopped. The veterans who once mocked the Americans' toy rifles now warned new recruits, "They shoot fast, don't underestimate them." The war had entered a new rhythm, a faster, louder, deadlier rhythm powered by American industry and innovation, and soon, that rhythm would thunder across the fields of Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, the M1 Garand was everywhere, in every barracks, every transport ship, every soldier's grip. By now it had become more than a weapon. It was part of the identity of the American fighting man. When paratroopers boarded their C-47s on the eve of D-Day, the last thing many checked wasn't their helmet or rations. It was the smooth, oiled action of the Garand. They trusted it completely. They knew that when the doors opened over Normandy, the rifle would be their only certainty in a sky full of chaos. The Germans, entrenched behind Atlantic Wall fortifications, waited with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. They were still armed mostly with bolt actions, precise but deliberate weapons, ill-suited for the storm that was coming. And when dawn broke over the beaches on June 6, 1944, that storm arrived, led by men whose rifles could answer every burst of German fire with twice the fury. It was June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Before the sun even rose, the coastlines of northern France trembled beneath the thunder of naval guns. The German soldiers, tired, anxious, and soaked by the cold morning spray, huddled in their concrete bunkers. They had been told the Allies might come, but few believed it would be this morning. Across the channel and the landing craft rocking violently on the gray water, American infantrymen sat in silence. Their helmets shook with every impact of the waves. The smell of salt oil and fear filled the air. In their hands they held something the Germans had laughed at years before, a rifle that looked too heavy, too complicated, too wasteful of ammunition. The M1 Garand, the ramps dropped. Chaos exploded. The first wave hit Omaha Beach. Bullets sliced through the mist, machine guns tearing the air to ribbons. Men stumbled, fell, crawled forward through the surf. But amidst the hell, the steady rhythm of the M1 Garand broke through. A precise, rapid series of 8 shots. Then a metallic ping, and another magazine snapped in. 8 more shots. 8 more flashes of defiance. In German bunkers, machine gunners shouted and reloaded. They had trained to fight bolt-action rifles, to count the pauses between each shot, to rise and fire when the enemy was cycling the bolt. But this time there were no pauses. The Americans kept firing, fast, accurate, relentless. The distinctive metallic ping of the Garand echoed across the beachhead. But before a German soldier could lift his head, another American had already reloaded and was firing again. Within hours, German infantry commanders were reporting something strange over the radios. Feind feuert wie Maschinengewehre, aber es sind Gewehre. The enemy fires like machine guns, but they are rifles. Confusion spread. How could so many semi-automatic rifles be in the hands of regular infantrymen? Germany's elite units, Waffen-SS, Fallschirmjäger, Panzer Grenadiers, had been issued semi-automatic weapons like the G-43, or the MP-44 in limited numbers. But they were rare, expensive, prone to jamming. Yet here every American seemed to have one. The difference was not just mechanical. It was psychological. American infantry moved differently. They advanced with confidence, knowing they could fire rapidly without losing accuracy. Squads operated with fluid rhythm. 2 men covering, 2 men moving. The M1 gave them fire superiority at every range under 500 meters. Meanwhile, German units, trained in the doctrine of fire and movement led by machine guns, suddenly found their advantage shrinking. Their MG-42s were deadly, yes, unmatched in rate of fire. But when the belt ran dry, when the barrels overheated, when resupply lagged, the riflemen beside them couldn't sustain the volume of fire. The Americans could, and that changed everything. By midday, as the tide rose and tanks began crawling ashore, the reality became undeniable. The United States had achieved not only industrial superiority, it had achieved tactical superiority through firepower distribution. Every soldier carried a piece of that industrial power in his hands. The M1 Garand was not just a rifle. It was the sound of American industry in combat, mass-produced precision that never faltered. In hedgerows and towns across Normandy, it kept proving itself. At Carentan, at St. Lo, at Hill 192. German soldiers, once trained to time their counterfire by the rhythm of a bolt-action rifle, found themselves overwhelmed by a wall of bullets that seemed to come from everywhere at once. One German report, recovered after the war, described it plainly. The American riflemen can fire so quickly that we mistake small groups for entire companies. And in that moment, on the beaches, in the fields and among the burning villages of France, the legend of the M1 Garand was sealed not by propaganda, but by experience. The rifle that the Germans had once dismissed as wasteful was now the instrument of their retreat. But this was only the beginning. For what followed, as the Allies broke out from Normandy and drove toward the German border, would prove that this weapon wasn't just a tool of survival. It was a weapon of momentum, and momentum in war is everything. Artillery. They were still armed mostly with bolt actions, precise but deliberate weapons, ill-suited for the storm that was coming. And when dawn broke over the beaches on June 6, 1944, that storm arrived, led by men whose rifles could answer every burst of German fire with twice the fury. By late July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had turned from green labyrinths into graveyards of armor. Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout, was underway. Thunderclouds of artillery rolled across the countryside as American forces finally tore open the German lines west of St. Lo. And in that storm of steel and smoke, the M1 Garand became the voice of the offensive. For months, U.S. infantry had been pinned in tight fields bordered by dense, ancient hedgerows and perfect terrain for ambushes. German soldiers hidden behind earthen walls had inflicted heavy losses, but when the breakout began, tactics evolved. U.S. squads learned to fight hedgerow to hedgerow, advancing under the steady rhythm of semi-automatic fire. 2 riflemen would keep the Germans pinned, while a third sprinted forward. Then, as soon as the team reached a new position, the Garands opened up again. 8-round bursts of fast, precise fire cutting through leaves, branches, and smoke. The bolt-action Kar 98K, reliable but slow, could not match that tempo. German soldiers could barely expose themselves long enough to fire before being forced back under the American volleys. What once seemed a technological curiosity now dictated the pace of the battlefield. At close range, the Garand's 30-06 rounds tore through wooden doors, thin walls, and even the sides of light vehicles. It was devastating in house-to-house fighting. From Normandy villages to the streets of Aachen, American soldiers described its recoil as firm but manageable, its accuracy unmatched. They no longer thought about shooting and ducking. They could fight and win without waiting for a machine gun team to support them. And the Germans noticed. Captured Wehrmacht officers, interrogated after the breakout, repeatedly mentioned the same phrase. Euer Gewehr ist zu schnell. Your rifle is too fast. The Garand was fast. Too fast for the old doctrines, too fast for the bolt-action rhythm of 1918, too fast for any defense that relied on the enemy's pauses. By autumn 1944, the American advance pushed into Belgium and the Netherlands. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western wall, loomed ahead. The air grew colder, the mud thicker, but the riflemen pressed on. For the first time since the war began, German forces were fighting a retreat they could not reverse. Their Tiger tanks and 88mm guns could still destroy, but they couldn't stop the tide of men advancing behind the Garand's unbroken rhythm. Every village, every street, every bridge echoed with the same metallic cadence. 8 shots, ping, reload, 8 more. And then came December 1944, the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the largest German counteroffensive on the Western Front. Snow blanketed the forests of Belgium. The cold was biting, the visibility low. American troops, stretched thin after months of fighting, suddenly faced a massive surprise assault. Columns of German armor burst through the fog, supported by SS Panzer units and paratroopers. Towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vith were encircled. The Allies were outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched, because in the frozen forests, speed of fire became survival. American soldiers dug into foxholes, their breath steaming in the air, fingers numb around the steel and walnut of the Garand. German infantry advanced through the trees, moving in tight groups, confident that the element of surprise would carry them through. But what met them was not confusion. It was precision. The Garands opened up, rapid, organized, mechanical, each rifle firing as though part of a greater machine. The first line dropped to a knee, reloading while the second fired. The semi-automatic action kept the rhythm unbroken even in sub-zero conditions, where many German rifles jammed or froze. At 200 meters, the 30-06 rounds cut through snow and smoke, dropping men before they could fire back. German assault teams reported taking fire as if from light machine guns, not realizing that it was ordinary rifle squads holding the line. At Bastogne, surrounded and low on supplies, the 101st Airborne held their ground. Their M1s cracked through the cold air with mechanical regularity, each shot a heartbeat of defiance. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts." That spirit, the stubborn will to fight, was amplified by a weapon that never hesitated. The Garand kept working when everything else froze. It kept firing when men's fingers were too numb to feel. It was a symbol of endurance, steel and discipline bound together by the will of its soldiers. By the time the skies cleared and Patton's Third Army smashed through the German encirclement, the myth had become fact. The Germans who survived the Ardennes wrote later that they feared the American riflemen most of all, not the tanks, not the planes, but the infantry who seemed to fire without end. Because when they heard that metallic ping echo through the woods, they knew another magazine was already sliding in, and somewhere beyond the next ridge another rifleman was waiting to do the same. When the smoke lifted, the German offensive had failed. Their reserves were gone, their armor shattered, and their infantry, once the pride of Europe, had learned that no amount of discipline could withstand the relentless rhythm of industrial firepower. The rifle that had once drawn laughter now dictated defeat. And yet, even as Germany reeled from its failed counterattack, the war was not over. The Allies were closing in. The Rhine was next. And with every crossing, every skirmish, every desperate German defense, one truth echoed across the continent. The M1 Garand was no longer a question of design. It was the voice of victory. Spring 1945. The thunder of the Western Front was rolling eastward now, toward the Rhine, toward the heart of the Reich. German cities smoldered under Allied air raids. Bridges lay in ruins, and every river crossing had become a desperate defense. Yet among the chaos, amid the sound of collapsing armies, a quiet truth spread among the surviving German soldiers. They had underestimated the American riflemen, captured diaries. Reports and debriefings painted the same picture. At first, German officers had believed the M1 Garand was an extravagant, over-mechanized weapon, unsuited to the mud and grit of war. But after Normandy, that judgment changed. Field reports began noting the weapon's consistency. Der amerikanische Soldat feuert weiter, selbst wenn sein Lauf glüht. The American soldier keeps firing, even when his barrel glows. German soldiers who had once mocked it in training films now spoke of it with reluctant respect, even fear. The Garand's reliability was unlike anything they had encountered. While their own semi-automatic G43 rifles jammed in the mud or froze in the snow, the Garand kept cycling, a testament to the precision of American mass production. When Allied forces reached the Rhine in March 1945, the river crossings became brutal. Machine guns and mortars swept the banks, tracer fire cut across the night, and every bridge was a killing zone, yet again. It was the individual riflemen, armed with the Garand, who pushed forward under the storm. American infantry units stormed pontoon bridges with relentless momentum. When German snipers tried to hold them at range, the semi-automatic rifles answered faster than they could adjust. The rhythm of the Garand, that mechanical tempo of 8 shots, reload, 8 more, became the heartbeat of the assault. And when the crossing succeeded, when the Rhine fell behind them and the road to Germany lay open, Allied commanders took note. The rifle had done what tanks and artillery could not. It gave the infantry dominance in every engagement under 500 yards. In captured German armories, American soldiers found stacks of Kar 98K rifles, beautifully made, rugged, but outdated. Each one a symbol of an old philosophy: craftsmanship over quantity, precision over practicality. The Garand was the opposite. It was designed for production, for scale, for a war of nations, not individuals. In 1945, as American forces swept through Germany, they carried nearly 6 million M1 Garands, each one identical, each one deadly, each one proof of what industrial warfare had become: a single rifle, perfected by John C. Garand years earlier at the Springfield Armory, had become the ultimate soldier's equalizer. By April, the last German defenses crumbled. In the ruins of towns like Remagen, Nuremberg, and finally Berlin, what remained of the Wehrmacht fought with desperation. But the tempo of battle was no longer theirs. Where once they had dictated engagements with disciplined fire and tactical precision, they were now reacting, always reacting, to a force that could sustain firepower across every inch of the battlefield. The Garand was not just a rifle. It was a symbol of a larger truth: the transition from elite warfare to industrial dominance. Every pull of its trigger was backed by an economy that could outbuild, outshoot, and outlast its enemies, and yet, amid the destruction, many German veterans, even decades later, would admit something remarkable. They respected the M1 Garand not because it killed efficiently, but because it reflected something deeper in the men who carried it: determination, endurance, and an unshakable belief that they could not be stopped. The rifle embodied the American spirit of the war: practical, powerful, relentless. But even as victory neared, the M1 story didn't end. Its legacy was already spreading beyond Europe. In the Pacific, across volcanic islands and jungles drenched in rain, another army of Americans carried the same rifle, facing an enemy far different from the Germans, but no less fierce. From Normandy to Okinawa, the Garand remained unchanged, still firing, still reliable, still unmatched. And that was perhaps its greatest triumph. It was not just the weapon of one front, but of an entire world war. The end of the conflict was approaching. Hitler was gone. Berlin had fallen. The Allies stood victorious. But as peace settled over the ruins of Europe, the lessons of the Garand would echo into every army, every doctrine, every weapon that followed. Because those who survived, on both sides, knew that this rifle had changed the very shape of infantry warfare. Across Europe, the rubble still smoked: shattered cities, broken empires, and the exhausted survivors of 6 long years. The world's armies now stood at a crossroads. Every commander, every engineer, every nation asked the same question: what had truly won the war? The answers came not from speeches or strategies, but from the soldiers who returned from the front lines. They spoke not of grand tactics or secret weapons, but of a rifle that never stopped firing: the M1 Garand. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers began examining captured weapons, tactics, and manufacturing processes. They were astonished at what they found: not only the complexity of German engineering, but the contrast between philosophy and practicality. Germany's arsenal was filled with masterpieces: the MG-42, the Panther tank, the STG-44, each brilliant in concept, deadly in action, but built for quality over quantity.